Earl Anthony Wayne holds the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service Career Ambassador. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. He's currently a policy fellow, a public policy fellow with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Tony, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to ask you about this piece that you wrote with a fellow ambassador, Arturo Siricán, former ambassador from Mexico to the U.S., towards a North American foreign policy footprint. But before we dive into some of the details of what you've written, I want to just ask you to characterize for us the current state of U.S.-Mexico relations after the rocky start that occurred when President Trump took office.
Well, I'd say both governments are now working on the problems that were identified by the new U.S. administration. They aren't solved, but at least they're engaging, they're talking about them. They're getting ready for serious negotiations, for example, on the North American Free Trade Agreement in a couple of months. And they're talking about immigration and security at the border. Once again, these are still very serious differences that need to be worked through. But there's a recognition, I think, now that it's through serious talks, sitting at the table together, that we should work on these things.
The time for the heated rhetoric has passed. Now things get serious. So. The notion here essentially about unfulfilled potential in many ways between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. You talk about a North American strategic framework, and then you also go on to talk about an international footprint. Could you explain what that means to us and what the potential is?
Certainly. The idea here, or the model, is that we share so much interest in common on prosperity and security that we should be working together better, both between us, the two of us, all three of us, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and then with others and looking out at international problems. I think it's important to remember that Mexico, for example, is the country that touches the daily lives of more American citizens than any other country in the world. This is because there's just so much that's both domestic and international that is tied up in this relationship, whether it's security or jobs or cultural heritage. There are just many things that tie us together. Now, some of those same things mean that we will take a different approach, and we need to work through to find a common solution or a common way forward. But that makes it important that we do act together, and it creates a potential for doing good things internationally.
Even with all these deep ties, and even with deep disagreement on certain issues, do you think there's certain complacency in place between these three nations because we have been peaceful neighbors for so long?
Well, it is one of the very important things and notable things about this relationship is that we have two neighbors that are oceans, and we have two other neighbors who are basically friends. They want to have a good, positive relationship. They're not threats to the United States. They want to work with us on a number of issues for their own good, but in mutual good as well. And that's different, if you think about it, than most other world powers. We are really in a very fortunate situation.
I want to ask you about essentially two categories of opportunities that you identify. Things that we're already doing that we could enhance, and then maybe some things we aren't doing that we could start to do to the benefit of all the nations involved. Start with that first category. Where do you see opportunities for enhancement?
Well, first, let me start at the core interest that is usually shared, which is security. So we are working together to identify any potential terrorists, any potential extremists who might try to come into the United States through Mexico. And through Canada also. But we can deepen that cooperation. The goal is really to have a border that is the perimeter of North America and then beyond. And the beyond comes in working with the embassies of all three countries around the world, and when people come to try to get visas to visit, to have a better coordination. So if there are any bad people we know about trying to come in, we can communicate that immediately and smoothly between the governments concerned. So we're doing a bit of that, but we can go further in that. And that's the same thing if you think about international criminal organizations. Sadly, there's clearly a lot of crime that takes place across all of North America. And drugs do come up through Mexico and from Mexico to the United States. But once they get to the U.S. border, they then cross the United States. So this is a problem where there can be there can be better cooperation, better coordination to try and get at these criminal groups. And those groups are taking the money, billions and billions that they make in the United States, and they're sending it back to Mexico, often using it to buy arms in the United States, taking it back home, and then using that to kill, intimidate in their communities. So there's a lot of good that can be done there, for example. The other big example is in the area of migration. In the last several years, the large number of migrants coming into the United States from the South have been from Central America. They have left their home countries, crossed Mexico, and then tried to get into the United States. Some of them try to stay in Mexico also. So we've developed a much stronger coordination with Mexico, both to deal with these human flows and with the smugglers who are trying to take advantage of these people, but also started to look and talk about how we can help the governments in Central America to deal with the problems that are making those people leave. That is, in a couple of the countries, very bad criminal violence, gangs, and it's about the lack of economic opportunity. So there's an opportunity for Mexico, the United States, and Canada to help those countries address those problems.
Are there things that aren't currently on the agenda where you see opportunity for new types of collaborations?
Well, one of the things where I think we've been growing in our cooperation, for example, has been in the Western Hemisphere in support for democracy. And we just had an example in the past few days where the foreign minister of Mexico spoke out in favor of democracy in Venezuela and was one of those calling for the Venezuelan government to respect all the elements of the Charter of the States of the Western Hemisphere. And he was joined by the United States, Canada, and others in this effort. But it is really a large step forward in the countries of the region to put public pressure on Venezuela to respect its own democracy and the principles of democracy. And I think there are more examples of that can take place.
You're describing coordinated foreign policy.
It is coordinated foreign policy. And it's a big evolution between the United States and Mexico, who, for example, back in the 1980s had very large differences about their foreign policies. Still, by the turn of the century, 2000, they were talking to each other, but the coordination wasn't that close. And then over the past 15 years, there's really been an evolution, so we now have dialogues about practically every part of the world.
One of the words that comes to mind when I read what you and Ambassador Sircon have written is vision, the vision thing. Is there vision beyond the co-authors for this type of enhanced collaboration on the North American continent?
I think there is. And part of it comes from a different vision of economic cooperation in the world and an idea that regions around the world are cooperating more closely in production chains, in networks where you actually make things together, and that those regions are competing, not just individual countries. And that's because with your neighbors, you actually each have some advantages, and you can make things better and less expensive if you're doing it together sometimes. Not always, but in some cases. And I think there's a sense that North America is doing that, despite as you know, there's been quite a bit of criticism of NAFTA. But in reality, the economic studies have pointed out that it's been an economic benefit to all three countries, and that the large sources of job loss in the United States were not because of NAFTA, even if people believe that. They were because of competition with China and new technology, automation that's been introduced.
So you agree with notions that it needs to be updated, but you're cautioning against throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Exactly. There's no doubt this is a 23-year-old agreement. It can be updated. We've learned things that don't function well in the agreement, but there are also new things like electronic commerce, data flows, other things that need to be incorporated into a modern agreement so we can actually be more competitive in the world, all three of the countries. It's one thing to think about a trade agreement as a win-loss, but what a trade agreement should be is win-win. It doesn't mean there aren't some people that might suffer a bit from an agreement. That certainly happens. But the basic idea is that both countries should come out in a better place from a well-negotiated free trade agreement, or free and fair agreement, as people are now calling it. And there's no reason that this North American agreement can't be improved and be of benefit to all three countries.
Does the discussion of renegotiating NAFTA or re-examining NAFTA, is that at the center of, at least in the short term, how much of these potentials can be tapped into? In other words, if you can't agree on that, does everything else become problematic?
Well, if you can't agree on NAFTA and you can't agree on immigration, then you have a difficult situation. The relationship will go on, but
geography alone, and
we aren't going to move away.
That's right.
That's the one important thing to remember. But it will have a negative effect. On the other hand, there is no reason that there can't be a good, solid, negotiated outcome that both countries can accept. And that's on both issues. I might just mention for a moment on the immigration issue. There's also been a tremendous evolution in immigration over the past decade. Over 1 million fewer Mexicans of illegal or irregular status are now in the United States than was the case in 2007. They've been going home for a number of reasons. One, there are jobs back home. They want to go back to their families and their communities. And they aren't being replaced by a net flow from the south to the north, because also there are more jobs in Mexico, in part because we have this good trading relationship between the two countries. So Mexico has the opportunity now to provide that higher level of prosperity for its own people, which is a benefit to the United States at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't immigration-related problems that need to be addressed. There are. There's those illicit flows across the border of drugs and people and guns that need to be addressed. But it's not quite the problem as it has sometimes been described in the campaign speeches.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts today, and alert those watching that if you'd like a copy of this report, you can find it at wilsoncenter.org under the Mexico Institute's area. There's a research tab, find the Mexico Institute. In the meantime, Ambassador Tony Wayne, thank you. It's refreshing to hear some optimism for the future when we sometimes get mired in the problems of the moment. So thanks very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.